My daughter brought my wife home totally drunk after a girls' night out, one she swore had no guys allowed, while I was fixing a pipe in the shower. She said, "Dad, we need the shower now. Get out." I told her I had to jump in right away, but she shoved me aside. "What's going on?" I asked, confused. Then my daughter said, "I know it's sick, but that's what happened." As she pulled off my wife's dress, my face froze in shock. You know what they say about control? It's like a good suit from Tom Ford. When it fits right, nobody notices. When it doesn't, everybody can see the threads coming apart. At 11 p.m. on a Tuesday that started like any other billionaire's nightmare, I was wedged behind the shower panel in our Upper West Side penthouse, wrestling with a compression nut that had more attitude than a federal judge on a bad day. The thing about fixing pipes yourself when you've got enough in your portfolio to hire every plumber from here to Silicon Valley, it's not about the money. It's about the control. Same reason I still read every line of our Series B term sheets instead of letting my CFO handle it. Same reason I personally review compliance reports for our legal tech SaaS platform instead of delegating it to some deputy manager who might miss the fine print that could tank our stock price faster than a whistleblower report on CNBC. Control calms me. Always has, ever since law school graduation when I realized that life's just one big contract negotiation, and the guy who reads the terms closest usually wins. Tonight, though, that philosophy was about to get stress-tested harder than a startup's financials during due diligence. "Babe, I'm heading out." Serena's voice carried from the master bedroom, sharp and expensive like her perfume. Through the bathroom door, I caught a glimpse of black dress, the kind that costs more than most people's cars and hugs in all the right places. Designer gowns were her weakness, like Macallan, 25-year-old, was mine. "Girls' night out," she called, heels clicking across our marble floors with the confidence of someone who'd never had to explain a line item to investors. "Tiffany's bachelorette party. You know how it is, no guys allowed." I grunted acknowledgement while torquing the wrench. The water pressure in our penthouse had been acting up for weeks, and our building's general manager kept giving me the runaround about fixing it. When you're worth enough to be on the Forbes list, you'd think basic plumbing wouldn't be an issue. But money can't buy competence. Just ask any venture capitalist who's watched a promising startup burn through series of funding on crystal chandeliers and BMW company cars. "Don't wait up," Serena said, appearing in the doorway. She leaned down to kiss me, and I caught that scent. Expensive, complex, with notes that probably cost more per ounce than most people make in a day. You know how these bachelorette things go? Probably margaritas until 2 a.m. Then someone's crying about their ex-boyfriend while we're calling Ubers. I chuckled, not looking up from my work. Just don't let Tiffany do anything that'll end up trending on Twitter. Her father's firm is handling our IPO documentation, and the last thing we need is his daughter making headlines for the wrong reasons. She laughed, but there was something off about it. Like when a client laughs at your joke during a deposition, but you can tell they're calculating how much this conversation is going to cost them. A delay, maybe half a second too long, like she was rehearsing an alibi instead of just agreeing with her husband's bad joke. "Don't be such a lawyer," she said, but her voice had that forced lightness people use when they're trying too hard. "It's just girls being girls. Nothing that would interest the U.S. Attorney's Office." That should have been my first red flag. Who mentions federal investigators when talking about a bachelorette party? But I was elbow deep in plumbing, thinking about tomorrow's board meeting and whether our latest AI feature set was ready for the market positioning we'd promised our strategic partners. The front door slammed with the kind of finality that echoes through a place with 12-foot ceilings and enough square footage to house a small law firm. I heard the elevator ding, then silence. The kind of silence that costs 8 figures a year to maintain in Manhattan. Doormen who don't gossip. Neighbors who mind their own billionaire business. Walls thick enough to muffle whatever family drama might unfold behind them. For the next 3 hours, I worked on that pipe like I was negotiating a hostile takeover. Every turn of the wrench was methodical, precise. The compression nut finally gave way, and water flowed clean and strong. I tested the pressure, checked for leaks, made sure everything was perfect. That's how I approach everything. Whether it's plumbing or profit margins, you do it right the first time, or you end up paying for it later. I was just about to call it a night when I heard heavy footsteps in the hallway. Not Serena's heels, something heavier, more urgent. The front door opened, and I heard Maya's voice, strained and careful like she was trying not to wake the whole building. Easy, Mom. Just get to the bathroom. Dad's probably still in there with his tools. Maya appeared in the doorway, half carrying Serena like she was evidence that needed to be moved before the crime scene investigators showed up. My wife's black dress was wrinkled. Her hair looked like she'd been in a wind tunnel, and her designer heels were dangling from Maya's free hand like abandoned exhibits. The alcohol hit me first, not just wine or cocktails, but that sour smell of someone who'd been drinking hard and fast. But underneath that, something else. A scent that definitely wasn't mine. Men's cologne, heavy and obvious, the kind that screams, I drive a leased BMW and think a Rolex makes me interesting. Dad? Maya said, not quite meeting my eyes. We need the shower now. Like, right now. You need to get out. I looked at my daughter, 22, Princeton grad, sharp as the attorneys at the most expensive firm in the city, and saw something I'd never seen before. Fear. Not the kind you feel before a court appearance or a hostile board meeting. The kind that comes from seeing something you can't unsee. I need to jump in and test this pipe first, I said, reaching for the shower handle. Just give me 2 minutes to make sure the pressure's. No. Maya's voice cut through the steam like a subpoena. Dad, get out. Now. She didn't push me physically, but she might as well have. There was an authority in her voice that reminded me of myself during litigation. When you know the facts, and you know the other side knows you know, and there's no point in pretending otherwise. The wrench slipped from my hand, clattering against the marble like a gavel hitting the bench. Steam hissed from the showerhead, filling the room with a fog that somehow made everything less clear instead of more. And that's when I felt it. Something fundamental shifting in my house, in my life, in the careful structure I'd built around myself like a fortress made of contracts and compliance reports and revenue projections. For the first time in years, maybe decades, I wasn't the one in control anymore. I stepped out of that bathroom like a defendant leaving the witness stand after a cross-examination that didn't go according to plan. Behind me, I heard Maya guiding Serena into the shower, her voice gentle but firm, like a prosecutor walking a key witness through testimony that's going to change everything. The compression nut was tight. The water pressure was perfect. But something in my perfectly controlled world had just sprung a leak that no amount of legal expertise or financial leverage was going to fix. Steam climbed the mirror like smoke signals from a burning portfolio, and Maya's voice cut through it with the flat precision of a paralegal reading a bad affidavit to a room full of disinterested associates. The kind of tone that says, I'm about to tell you something that's going to ruin your day, and there's not a damn thing either of us can do about it. She guided Serena toward the shower stall like she was escorting a hostile witness to the stand. Careful, deliberate, but with an urgency that made my chest tighten. This wasn't the Maya who used to argue with me about curfews or ask for advances on her trust fund to buy some overpriced handbag. This was Maya operating in crisis mode, the way I'd taught her to handle everything from prep school drama to college applications. See the problem, assess the damage, control the narrative. Now, Dad, please. It wasn't a request. It was the kind of directive you hear in board meetings when someone's about to get fired, or in courtrooms when the judge is done with your bullshit. Maya had inherited my ability to make polite words sound like ultimatums, and right now she was wielding that skill like a scalpel. I stepped sideways to block them, still gripping that useless wrench like it was going to help me fix whatever was broken here. What's going on? My voice sounded weird in my own ears, like I was cross-examining my own life and not liking the answers I was getting. Maya didn't meet my eyes. That's when I knew we'd moved past family drama into federal case territory. In 22 years, my daughter had never been afraid to look me in the face. Not when she crashed the Tesla into the country club's fountain. Not when she got suspended from her prep school for organizing an underground poker game that would have made our venture capitalist buddies proud. I know it's sick, but that's what happened. She started, and those 8 words hit me like a class action lawsuit you didn't see coming. The kind that starts with a whisper and ends with your company's stock price in free fall and reporters camping outside your Upper West Side penthouse. She reached for Serena's dress, that expensive black number that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, and started working at the straps with the efficiency of someone dismantling evidence. The fabric caught for a moment, designer material resisting like it knew what was about to be revealed. then slid down with the inevitability of a guilty verdict. That's when I saw them. Details that would have been exhibits A through Z in any divorce proceeding worth its billionaire retainer fees. Glitter that definitely hadn't come from our marble-floored penthouse or any charity gala we'd attended recently. The kind of cheap, sparkly shit you find in dive bars where people think a bottle of Grey Goose makes them high-end. But it was the lipstick print that really got my attention. Dark red, almost burgundy, smeared near her collarbone like someone had been signing their name on my wife. Not Serena's usual shade. She wore the kind of understated colors that whispered wealth instead of screaming for attention. This was the lipstick equivalent of a hostile takeover bid. Aggressive, obvious, and designed to leave a mark. And underneath it all, that cologne. Not subtle like the Tom Ford the First wore, or the expensive shit you smell at private equity galas where everyone's trying to outclass everyone else. This was loud, crude, the olfactory equivalent of a guy who thinks leasing a BMW makes him Warren Buffett and wearing a fake Rolex makes him investment grade. My face went through what I imagine is the same transformation judges experience when they realize the case in front of them is going to be a lot more complicated than the docket suggested. First confusion, then recognition, then that cold settling of facts that can't be argued with or negotiated around. The shower roared to life behind me, steam billowing like the fog of war, and I just stood there holding that wrench like an idiot. Here I was, a guy who'd built a fortune by reading people and situations, who could spot fraud in a financial statement from 3 conference rooms away, who'd negotiated deals worth more than most countries' GDP, and I couldn't process what I was seeing in my own bathroom. Maya worked with the focused intensity of a compliance officer cleaning up after a regulatory disaster. She guided Serena under the water, washing away evidence with the methodical precision of someone who understood that some stains don't come out, no matter how expensive your soap is or how hot you run the water. The party wasn't what you thought it was, Maya said, her voice carrying over the sound of water hitting marble tiles that cost more per square foot than most people make in a month. Aunt Lila called me around 10:30, said I needed to come get Mom, that it wasn't normal bachelorette stuff. I wanted to ask what the hell that meant, but part of me already knew. The same instinct that had made me successful in business, that had helped me spot bad investments and worse partners, was screaming at me that I didn't want the details. Some knowledge is like insider trading information. Once you have it, you can't unknow it, and it changes every decision you make going forward. There were guys there, Maya continued, not looking at me while she shampooed Serena's hair like she was washing away a crime scene that no one would ever report to the authorities. Not just regular guys. The kind of guys who think a cowboy hat and a tight t-shirt make them God's gift to married women at suburban house parties. The cologne smell got stronger as the water heated up, like evidence being steamed out of expensive fabric. I recognized it now, the kind of aggressive scent you smell in hotel bars where divorced executives go to make bad decisions, or at networking events where small-time entrepreneurs try to convince venture capitalists they're worth a Series A investment. I know it's sick, Maya said again, and her voice had that careful steadiness that meant she was holding back worse details. The kind of restraint I'd taught her when dealing with hostile depositions or board meetings where every word could end up quoted in the Wall Street Journal. Serena swayed under the water like a hostile witness who'd been caught in too many lies to keep track of. Her eyes were closed, but I couldn't tell if it was from shame or alcohol or just the weight of knowing that 15 years of marriage had just been marked to market, and the valuation wasn't looking good. I stepped out of that bathroom like a CEO leaving a board meeting where the vote of no confidence had just passed. Behind me, I could hear Maya's voice, gentle but firm, guiding her mother through what sounded like the corporate equivalent of crisis management. Damage control, reputation management, the kind of cleanup that happens after someone makes decisions that can't be undone with better PR or a more aggressive legal team. The compression nut was tight. The water pressure was perfect. But I was starting to realize that some leaks can't be fixed with tools, and some promises can't be repaired with good intentions and expensive attorneys. The warnings had been coming for months, slipping under the door of my consciousness like draft disclosures from a company trying to bury bad news in the footnotes. You know how it is when you're running a billion-dollar operation. You learn to prioritize the fires that can actually burn down your empire versus the ones that just singe your ego. Turns out I'd been categorizing my marriage wrong in the risk assessment. No guys allowed, she'd said that night. But the words came out too fast, like someone reading from a script they hadn't had time to rehearse properly. The kind of over-explanation that makes compliance officers nervous and federal investigators start asking follow-up questions. When you've spent 15 years listening to someone talk, you develop an ear for their natural rhythm. This wasn't it. The phone thing should have been my first real clue. We'd been married since before smartphones were smart, back when privacy meant closing the bathroom door, not flipping your device face down every time it buzzed. Serena's iPhone used to lie on our marble kitchen counter like an open book. Messages visible, calls answered in front of me. The digital equivalent of leaving your financial statements on the coffee table because you've got nothing to hide. But somewhere around the time our legal tech startup was closing its Series B funding round, her phone developed trust issues. Face down became the default position, like it was doing push-ups for infidelity. The 6-digit passcode appeared where a simple swipe used to suffice, and suddenly that device had more security protocols than our company's proprietary AI algorithms. Since when do you need Fort Knox-level protection for your Pilates schedule? I joked once, watching her guard that phone like it contained insider trading information that could tank our stock price. Identity theft is real, she'd replied, not missing a beat. You read about it in TechCrunch all the time. Better safe than sorry. Reasonable answer. Plausible explanation. The kind of response that would satisfy a junior associate during due diligence, but should have made a seasoned CEO dig deeper. I chose to believe her because the alternative was admitting that my wife might be running a side business I wasn't invested in. Then came the late-night screen glow. You know that blue light that seeps under bedroom doors like radioactive evidence? I'd wake up at 2 a.m. for a glass of water. Occupational hazard when you're drinking Macallan 25-year-old before bed to unwind from board meetings that could determine whether your company goes public or goes under. And there she'd be, thumbs moving across that screen like a day trader during market volatility. Can't sleep, she'd mumble when I asked, clicking the phone dark faster than an insider closing a position before the SEC notices. Just scrolling through Instagram. You know how it is. I knew how a lot of things were, but midnight Instagram sessions weren't one of them. Still, I filed it under quirks wives develop after 15 years of marriage rather than behavior patterns that warrant investigation. My mistake was thinking like a husband instead of a lawyer. The wardrobe evolution was more subtle, like a company slowly shifting its brand positioning without announcing a formal pivot. Dresses that used to hit mid-thigh started exploring new territory south of conservative and north of, are we going to a charity gala or casting call? Higher slits, lower necklines, the kind of designer adjustments that cost extra and signal intention. You look amazing, I'd tell her, because she did. Serena had always been beautiful, the kind of woman who could make a Tom Ford gown look casual or turn a simple black dress into a hostile takeover of every room she entered. But these new outfits weren't about looking good for me. They were about looking available for someone else. We've been married 15 years, not 15 days, she'd said once during a dinner that felt more like a deposition than conversation. We were sitting in our dining room with its crystal chandeliers reflecting off china that cost more than most people's cars, and the silence between us had developed the weight of a class action lawsuit nobody wanted to file. It's not always fireworks, she'd continued, cutting her steak with surgical precision. Real marriage is about partnership, stability, building something together. She was right about that last part. We had built something together. A fortune that put us on Forbes lists, a penthouse that overlooked Central Park like we owned it, a legal tech company that was revolutionizing how law firms handle compliance and contract management. Our portfolio included everything from venture capital investments to a private equity stake in a cybersecurity firm that protected half of Silicon Valley from ransomware attacks. But apparently, partnership and stability weren't enough when someone in a cowboy hat offered fireworks at a suburban house party. I'm a lawyer by training, Columbia Law, Order of the Coif, the whole 9 yards of academic excellence that's supposed to teach you how to spot lies and read people like financial statements. Litigation taught me that motives are usually simple, even when people try to dress them up in complex explanations. Securities fraud, tax evasion, conspiracy charges, they all boil down to someone wanting something they can't have legally and deciding the risk was worth the potential reward. But instead of applying those skills to my own life, I chose belief over evidence. I buried myself in work like a CEO, avoiding a hostile takeover by staying too busy to notice the warning signs. Advising our legal tech SaaS startup on term sheets for our Series B funding round, checking compliance on data sharing agreements for our AI feature sets, reviewing equity refresh proposals for employees who'd been with us since we were three guys in a shared office space eating ramen and dreaming about IPOs. I told myself we were busy, that successful couples go through phases where work takes precedence over romance, where building an empire requires sacrificing some of the small intimacies that matter to people whose biggest concern is making their mortgage payment on time. I convinced myself that trust was an asset you don't mark to market every quarter, that love was a long-term investment that would appreciate over time if you just held your position and didn't panic during short-term volatility. I was wrong about that, too. Turns out trust is exactly like a stock price. It reflects current market conditions, and when the fundamentals change, the valuation follows. I'd been holding a position in a marriage that had already been shorted by someone else, and I was too busy reading other people's contracts to notice the fine print in my own relationship was being rewritten without my consent. The compression nut was tight, the water pressure was perfect, but I was starting to understand that some structural problems can't be fixed with better tools or more attention to detail. Maya spoke over the hiss of the shower like a witness delivering testimony that would either save the defendant or send them to federal prison. Her voice had that careful, measured quality you develop when you know every word is going to matter later, when some high-priced attorney is going to dissect your statement looking for inconsistencies that could tank an entire case. The facts came out clean and chronological, the way I'd taught her to present information during those Sunday morning breakfast briefings where we discuss everything from her prep school drama to portfolio performance. Maya had always been sharp. Princeton didn't accept idiots, even ones whose trust funds could endow a small library. But tonight she was operating with the precision of a compliance officer filing a report that could trigger a federal investigation. Aunt Lila called me at 10:47. She said, adjusting the water temperature with the focus of someone who understood that details matter when your family's reputation is about to be marked to market. Not you. Me. That should have been your first clue that something was seriously fucked up. Language like that from Maya usually earned her a lecture about appropriate vocabulary for someone whose inheritance would someday include board positions at companies that employed half of Manhattan's legal district. Tonight, I let it slide. Some situations require industrial-strength profanity, and watching your mother destroy 15 years of marriage apparently qualified. She said, "Come get your mom. Now, don't ask questions, just come." The kind of tone you use when someone's about to do something that'll end up as evidence in a divorce proceeding that makes the society pages for all the wrong reasons. I watched steam fog up mirrors that cost more than most people's annual salaries while my daughter explained how she'd driven her BMW from her downtown apartment to some suburban house that definitely wasn't hosting the kind of bachelorette party they advertise in bridal magazines. The address Lila had given her led to a neighborhood where venture capitalists go to feel normal and tech executives pretend they understand middle-class values. The party wasn't in the main room, Maya continued, working shampoo through Serena's hair like she was washing away evidence that couldn't be allowed to reach a grand jury. You could hear music from the basement, the kind of bass that shakes wine glasses and makes the neighbors call the cops if they think they can get away with it without pissing off someone who might be connected to their mortgage company. The picture Maya painted was straight out of a compliance officer's worst nightmare. A house party that had started as something Pinterest-worthy, probably crystal chandeliers and designer gowns. The kind of event where wives of Fortune 500 CEOs go to network and pretend they're still the women they were before their husbands' IPOs changed everything. But parties have a way of evolving when someone decides the original agenda isn't exciting enough, and alcohol starts making decisions that stone-cold sobriety would never approve. I followed the noise downstairs, Maya said, her voice taking on the flat effect of someone recounting a crime scene they wish they could forget. The basement was set up like some wannabe nightclub. Black lights, probably $3,000 worth of sound equipment, and enough alcohol to stock a small country club. The kind of setup that screams midlife crisis louder than a Porsche in a strip mall parking lot. She paused, and I could see her calculating how much detail to include in her statement. This is what happens when you raise a kid in an environment where every conversation could eventually become part of a deposition. They learn to edit in real time, keeping the essential facts while protecting themselves and others from information that might prove embarrassing under cross-examination. There was a back room, she said finally, the words coming out like she was signing a confession. You know those finished basements that rich suburban women turn into craft rooms or home gyms? This one had been repurposed for activities that definitely weren't covered in the original architectural plans. The water kept running, washing away physical evidence while Maya's words provided the kind of testimony that would be inadmissible in court but impossible to unhear in real life. I stood there holding that wrench like it was going to help me fix something that couldn't be repaired with tools or good intentions or even the kind of money that makes federal judges return your phone calls. Music was shaking the floor. Maya continued, her voice steady despite the subject matter that would have made seasoned litigators uncomfortable. But you could still hear what was happening in that back room. The kind of sounds that make you understand why some houses have better soundproofing than others. She adjusted the shower pressure, buying herself time to figure out how to explain what came next without traumatizing her father more than absolutely necessary. Maya had always been protective of me in ways that probably weren't healthy for someone whose trust fund would eventually make her richer than most small countries. Tonight, that instinct was working overtime. I found her with some guy who looked like he'd gotten lost on his way to a line dancing competition, Maya said, the clinical tone cracking slightly. Shirtless, cowboy hat, jeans so tight, they probably required assistance from a team of engineers. The kind of guy who thinks owning a pickup truck makes him authentic and wearing bootcut jeans makes him country. The image hit me like a hostile takeover bid you don't see coming. Serena, who owned more designer gowns than some department stores, who could navigate charity galas with the skill of a diplomat and board meetings with the precision of a federal prosecutor, grinding against some suburban cowboy like she was auditioned for a music video that would never make it past the compliance department. They weren't exactly discussing portfolio management strategies, Maya added, and despite everything, I almost smiled. Even in crisis mode, my daughter couldn't resist a sarcastic observation. She'd inherited that from me, along with her eye for detail and her ability to spot bullshit from 3 time zones away. I called her name. Loud. The kind of volume you use when you're trying to prevent someone from making a decision that'll end up in divorce court. Maya's voice got harder, like she was testifying about something that still pissed her off. She looked at me like I was interrupting a board meeting instead of preventing her from becoming the lead story in some divorce attorney's worst-case scenario presentation. The shower kept running, steam kept rising, and Maya kept talking. But I'd stopped processing the details. Somewhere around cowboy hat and back room, my brain had shifted into the kind of protective shutdown mode that happens when you realize your entire life just became Exhibit A in a case you never wanted to file. I know it's sick, Maya said again, quieter now, like she was apologizing for being the messenger in a situation where someone had to deliver the bad news. But that's what happened. After midnight, when the steam had cleared and Maya had retreated to her room like a witness who'd delivered their testimony and wanted no part of the cross-examination, Serena lay on our Italian leather couch looking like a defendant who'd just been informed that the prosecution had video evidence. The blanket over her shoulders was cashmere, the kind that costs more than most people's monthly rent, but it might as well have been a prison jumpsuit for all the comfort it was providing. That cologne was still there under the expensive soap, clinging to her like a bad investment you can't write off no matter how much it's costing your portfolio. The scent was fainter now, diluted by hot water and designer shampoo, but it had the persistence of a federal investigation. You might think it's gone, but it's still there in the background, waiting to surface at the worst possible moment. "Why are you staring at me?" she asked, and her voice had that defensive edge people get when they know they're about to be cross-examined by someone who's very good at their job. She was trying for indignant, but it came out more like nervous, the way startup founders sound when venture capitalists start asking detailed questions about their burn rate. I sat in the matching chair, part of a set that had cost more than some people's cars and was probably going to be part of our asset division if this conversation went the way I thought it would. The marble floors felt cold under my bare feet, and the crystal chandeliers cast shadows that made our living room look more like a deposition chamber than the sanctuary where we used to discuss everything from Maya's college applications to our company's IPO timeline. You're sober enough to talk, I said, keeping my voice level. When you've spent years in litigation, you learn that the most devastating questions are delivered in the same tone you'd use to discuss quarterly revenue projections. Emotion is for amateurs and people who can't afford good legal representation. She tried to run a script, the kind of practiced response that would work on someone who hadn't spent 15 years learning to read her tells. It was just a joke, she started, words coming out like she was reciting a compliance manual she'd memorized but didn't understand. A bachelorette thing. You know how these parties get. Harmless fun. Everyone was being silly. The word harmless hung in the air like a bad earnings report, the kind that makes stock prices tank and sends investors running for safer portfolios. I let the silence stretch between us, a technique that worked in boardrooms and apparently was equally effective in living rooms where marriages go to die. Harmless, I repeated, like I was reading it back from a deposition transcript. That's an interesting choice of words for someone who had to be carried home by our daughter. Her smile cracked at the edges, developing fault lines like a company's public image right before a whistleblower report hit CNBC. She was realizing that her prepared statement wasn't going to survive even basic cross-examination, let alone the kind of detailed inquiry someone with my background could deliver if properly motivated. You're blowing this out of proportion, she tried again, but her voice had lost that confident edge. Now she sounded like a CEO trying to spin bad quarterly numbers for investors who could read financial statements better than she could lie. It was nothing. Just dancing. Just having fun. I kept my voice flat, like I was reading from a shareholder memo that contained information everyone in the room already knew but needed to hear stated officially. Our daughter dragged you out of a side room while you were grinding on some guy in a cowboy hat who smelled like he bought his cologne at a truck stop. The details hit her like a hostile takeover bid she hadn't seen coming. Her face went through the same progression I'd seen in boardrooms when someone realized their position was about to be liquidated. Denial, calculation, panic, then that cold acceptance that comes when you understand the game is over. Maya told you that. The question came out sharp, like she was looking for someone else to blame for her situation. Classic deflection technique. The kind that works on people who don't have law degrees and 15 years of experience spotting bullshit from 3 conference rooms away. Maya told me exactly what she saw, I said. Because unlike some people, she understands that truth doesn't become less true just because it's inconvenient. I leaned forward slightly, the way I did during negotiations when I wanted the other party to understand that their next words would determine whether this conversation ended with a handshake or a lawsuit. If you're going to lie to me, I continued, voice still level, still professional, at least do me the courtesy of rehearsing it first. This amateur hour performance is insulting to both our intelligence. She went quiet then, the kind of silence that happens in courtrooms right before someone changes their plea or in boardrooms right before someone tenders their resignation letter. The crystal chandeliers kept sparkling, the marble floors kept being expensive, and our penthouse kept costing more per month than most people make in a year, but none of that luxury could change the facts that were now sitting between us like evidence in a case that was already decided. The room felt like a board meeting right before a vote of no confidence. Everyone knows what's coming. Everyone knows how it's going to end, but you still have to go through the motions because that's how these things work. Due process. Professional courtesy. The illusion that there's still a chance for negotiation when everyone involved understands the outcome was determined the moment someone decided to grind against a cowboy in a suburban basement. I watched her calculate her options like a day trader, trying to minimize losses on a position that was never going to recover. She could double down on the lies, but we both knew I had enough information to make that strategy expensive. She could try for partial truth, but anyone who'd survived as long as I had in business would spot the gaps and exploit them. Or she could acknowledge reality and hope for terms that wouldn't completely destroy what was left of her position. This isn't how I wanted you to find out, she said finally. And those 8 words contained more truth than everything else she'd said since Maya dragged her through our front door. I nodded once, the way I did when opposing counsel finally admitted what we'd all known from the beginning. No, I agreed. I imagine it wasn't. At 3:27 a.m., her phone lit up like a trading floor during a market crash, casting blue light across our marble nightstand that cost more than most people's cars. The screen showed Ryder K. in letters that glowed with the persistence of a federal subpoena. Not my name, not her sister's, not anyone from our carefully curated social circle of Fortune 500 wives and venture capitalist spouses who understood that discretion was worth more than most people's annual salaries. The message preview showed just enough to make my chest tighten. Last night was wild. Next time, no interruptions, winking face. The winking emoji was like a signature on a confession, the kind of digital evidence that would make any compliance officer break into a cold sweat and start calculating legal exposure. I didn't touch the phone. Chain of custody matters when truth eventually goes to court, and 15 years of marriage had taught me that Serena was light sleeper when she was sober, but dead to the world when she'd been drinking like she was trying to forget something. Still, I memorized the timestamp, the sender, the preview text, all details that would matter later when lawyers started asking questions about when I knew what and how I knew it. The phone buzzed again at 3:31. Same sender. Can't stop thinking about those moves. You've got skills I didn't expect from a married woman. Each word was like a line item in an indictment, building a case that no reasonable jury would find sympathetic. I watched the screen fade to black, taking with it evidence that would resurface eventually, because these things always do. Digital footprints are harder to erase than offshore accounts, and people who think sexting is private have never been through a hostile divorce proceeding. Morning came with the artificial cheerfulness of a pharmaceutical company's earnings call after an FDA rejection. I made espresso using our machine that cost more than most people's monthly rent, the kind of perfect Italian engineering that promises consistency in a world where nothing else seemed reliable anymore. The ritual was comforting. Beans that cost $40 a pound, water heated to exactly the right temperature, crema thick enough to support a sugar cube if I'd been the kind of person who compromised perfect coffee with unnecessary additions. Serena appeared in the kitchen looking like a defendant who'd spent the night calculating plea bargain options. Her hair was perfect, the kind of expensive styling that survives everything except moral scrutiny. But her eyes had that hollow quality you see in CEOs right before they announce restructuring initiatives that everyone knows means massive layoffs. Aspirin, she mumbled, heading straight for the cabinet where we kept medications that cost more than most people's prescriptions but worked about as well as anything you could buy at a corner pharmacy. The hangover was obvious, but underneath that was something else. The kind of stress that comes from knowing your life is about to be audited by someone who's very good at finding discrepancies. Coffee, I offered, because even when your marriage is circling the drain like a failed startup burning through Series B funding, basic courtesy still applies. Besides, I needed her alert for what was coming next. She nodded, settling onto our kitchen island stool like she was taking the witness stand. The marble countertop between us felt like a conference table where hostile negotiations were about to commence. All crystal glasses and expensive surfaces that couldn't disguise the fact that someone was about to get screwed. While she sipped coffee that probably cost more per cup than most people spend on lunch, I called Marisol, a mutual friend who'd been at the party and had the kind of social connections that made her word valuable in circles where reputation was currency. Marisol ran a small accounting firm that handled taxes for half the tech executives in Manhattan, the kind of woman who understood that information was power and timing was everything. Your wife was certainly the life of the party, Marisol said when I reached her, voice carrying that careful neutrality people use when they're about to deliver news that's going to ruin someone's day. Very enthusiastic about that cowboy character. I have to say, I was surprised. Serena usually has more sense than that. Define enthusiastic, I said, keeping my voice level like I was reviewing a contract amendment rather than getting details about my wife's public humiliation. Let's just say if there had been a pole in that basement, she would have found a way to incorporate it into her performance. Marisol's laugh had no humor in it, the kind of sound compliance officers make when they discover irregularities that are going to require federal reporting. Look, I like Serena, but what I saw last night wasn't a woman having innocent fun. It was someone who decided marriage vows were more like corporate guidelines. Important in theory, but flexible when better opportunities presented themselves. I thanked Marisol and hung up, filing her words away like evidence in a case I was building against my own life. Serena was still nursing her coffee, probably calculating how much of last night I'd managed to piece together from Maya's testimony and whatever investigation I'd obviously started. After she disappeared into the shower, ironic, considering how much washing away of evidence had already occurred, I went hunting through our walk-in closet that was larger than most people's bedrooms. The black dress from last night was crumpled in the corner like a discarded alibi, expensive fabric holding on to secrets the way high-end materials hold their shape. I didn't touch it directly. Instead, I used a clean tissue to lift it, breathing in that unmistakable cologne that had nothing to do with my Tom Ford collection or any of the expensive scents that belonged in a household where taste was measured by price tags and sophistication was assumed rather than demonstrated. This smell was aggressive, obvious, the olfactory equivalent of a pickup truck with flames painted on the sides, designed to attract attention from women who should know better. The cologne was anchored in the fabric like a signed confession, impossible to deny and difficult to explain away. I took photos with my phone, documenting the stains, the wrinkles, the evidence that would matter when lawyers started asking uncomfortable questions about timelines and activities, and whether my wife understood the difference between marriage vows and corporate mission statements. Both important in principle, but apparently negotiable when someone in tight jeans offered better terms. I replaced everything exactly where I'd found it, maintaining chain of custody like I was preparing exhibits for federal court rather than a divorce proceeding that would probably be settled quietly to avoid embarrassing headlines about Fortune 500 families and their domestic difficulties. I set the evidence on our coffee table like a prosecutor arranging exhibits for a jury that already knew the defendant was guilty but needed to see the proof laid out in chronological order. The screenshots came first, time-stamped messages that glowed on my phone screen with the persistence of a federal investigation that wasn't going away. Then Marisol's handwritten note, pinned on letterhead from her accounting firm, because even character witnesses understood that credibility required official documentation when marriages went to court. Maya's statement came last. 3 pages of Princeton-educated precision, written in the kind of clear, factual prose that would make law professors proud and divorce attorneys salivate. She'd refused to say it again out loud, but she'd been willing to put it in writing, understanding that some testimony was too important to leave to memory and too painful to repeat every time someone needed to hear the truth. Serena stood in the doorway wearing a silk robe that cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payments, looking like a CEO who'd just been informed that the board was calling an emergency meeting to discuss her performance. Her hair was perfect, the kind of expensive styling that survives everything except moral scrutiny, but her face had the hollow quality of someone who'd realized their position was about to be liquidated whether they liked it or not. "You went through my phone?" The question came out sharp, like she was looking for procedural grounds to challenge evidence that was clearly authentic. It was the kind of deflection technique that worked in corporate settings where privacy policies mattered, but meant exactly nothing in living rooms where marriages were being dissolved. "Yes," I said, not bothering to dress it up with explanations or apologies. "And I'm glad I did." The simplicity of that admission was like pleading guilty to a charge everyone knew you'd committed. It saved time and eliminated any pretense that this was going to be a negotiation between equals. I gestured to the phone screen, where her conversation with Ryder K was displayed like evidence in a securities fraud case. "Would you like to read your messages out loud, or should I handle that part of the presentation?" She looked at the screenshots the way defendants look at surveillance footage, with the recognition that technology had made lying a lot more difficult and getting caught a lot more likely. The timestamps were there, the content was clear, and no amount of expensive legal representation was going to make those messages disappear. "Last night was wild," I read, voice level like I was reviewing quarterly earnings reports rather than destroying 15 years of marriage. "Next time, no interruptions." Your response, "Your trouble. Don't tempt me." Sent at 11:47 last night while I was fixing the shower and thinking my wife was at a bachelorette party. The words hung in the air like smoke from a burning portfolio, impossible to ignore and getting worse the longer you breathed them in. Serena's face went through the same progression I'd seen in boardrooms when someone realized their stock options were about to become worthless. Denial, calculation, panic, then that cold acceptance that comes when you understand the game is over. I slid Maya's statement across the coffee table, the pages making a sound like legal documents being filed with a court that wasn't going to be sympathetic to claims of innocence. Your daughter wrote this because she didn't want to have to say it again. She's 22 years old, Serena. She should be worrying about her trust fund and whether to take that job offer from the New York investment group. Instead, she's writing witness statements about watching her mother destroy her family. Serena picked up the pages like they might bite her, scanning lines that described her behavior with the clinical precision of someone documenting a crime scene. Maya had inherited my eye for detail and my ability to present facts without editorial commentary. Just what happened, when it happened, and who was there to see it. The basement room, the cowboy, the hands everywhere while music covered the sounds. I didn't need to read it aloud. Serena's face told me she was reliving every detail Maya had witnessed. She describes you as looking annoyed when she called your name, like our daughter was interrupting a business meeting instead of preventing you from becoming the star of someone's divorce attorney's worst-case scenario presentation. I mentioned the dress and the cologne, pointing to the photos I'd taken with the same methodical approach I used for documenting contract violations or regulatory compliance issues. Evidence was evidence, whether it was supporting a Series B funding round or a dissolution of marriage that would probably make the society pages for all the wrong reasons. Serena tried anger first, but it came out more like desperation. This is invasion of privacy. You can't just go through my personal things like I'm some kind of criminal. Her voice had the hollow ring of someone making arguments they knew wouldn't work, like a startup founder trying to convince venture capitalists that burning through cash wasn't really a problem. Then she shifted to shame, dropping to her knees beside my chair and gripping my hand like a client begging for a settlement that wasn't going to happen. It was one night, she said, voice breaking like a stock price during market volatility. One stupid night. It didn't mean anything. You know me better than that. The physical contact felt like someone trying to renegotiate a contract after they'd already breached the essential terms. Her hands were soft, the kind of expensive maintenance that came from having enough money to make time stop, at least cosmetically. But no amount of luxury skincare could change the fact that she'd made choices that couldn't be undone with better PR or more aggressive legal representation. You traded 15 years for a rented hat, I said, not pulling my hand away, but not returning the pressure either. The words came out like a verdict being read, final, factual, and completely devastating in their simplicity. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. The record was clear, the evidence was overwhelming, and we both understood that this wasn't a negotiation anymore. It was just me explaining to my wife that her marriage had been marked to market, and the valuation wasn't looking good for her position. I moved to the guest room with the same methodical precision I'd used to restructure a failing subsidiary. No drama, no emotional speeches, just a pillow and a closed door that spoke louder than any board meeting resignation letter. The room had Italian marble floors, designer furniture, and a view of Central Park that probably cost more per square foot than most people's entire apartments. It was temporary luxury, but luxury nonetheless, which seemed appropriate given that my entire marriage had apparently been a temporary arrangement disguised as a long-term investment. The workshop lock got changed first, not because I thought Serena was going to rifle through my tools, but because control starts with securing your base of operations. When hostile takeovers begin, the smart money protects critical infrastructure before worrying about public relations or damage control. That workshop was where I fixed things, pipes, budgets, contracts, problems that could be solved with the right tools and enough attention to detail. Now I needed a space where I could think without interruption, like a CEO planning defensive strategies against shareholders who'd lost confidence in current management. The Tesla got retitled to my holding LLC faster than you could say asset protection. The paperwork had been sitting in my desk for months anyway. Standard wealth management practice when your portfolio reaches 8 figures and estate planning attorneys start talking about liability shields and tax efficiency. Serena's name came off the registration like she'd never existed, which seemed poetic considering she'd apparently been test driving other models without bothering to inform the primary leaseholder. Her add-on credit cards got canceled next, the kind of financial restructuring that would make CFOs proud and spouses panic. Not revenge, risk management. When someone demonstrates they can't be trusted with your marriage vows, it's probably time to audit their access to your liquid assets. Amex didn't ask questions when I explained I was streamlining account management for better fiscal oversight. Corporate speak works everywhere, even when you're explaining why your wife's shopping privileges just got terminated. The cash transfer took longer, but felt more satisfying. Watching seven figures move from joint accounts to my personal banking felt like divesting from a company whose fundamentals had deteriorated beyond recovery. Numbers don't lie the way people do, and seeing those balances shift gave me the same cold satisfaction I got from closing profitable quarters or watching our stock price climb after positive earnings reports. The brokerage equity got moved into a trust structure with me as trustee and Maya as beneficiary, because some assets are too important to leave vulnerable to community property laws or vindictive ex-wives who might think emotional damage entitles them to financial compensation. Maya would be taken care of regardless of how this divorce proceeding played out, and that gave me the same peace of mind I felt after securing Series B funding or signing contracts with venture capital backing. At work, I wore my Tom Ford suit like armor, the kind of expensive tailoring that signals competence and stability when your personal life is getting audited by family court attorneys. The fabric cost more than most people's monthly salaries, but it was worth every penny when board members needed to see that leadership remained focused despite domestic complications that could potentially impact company morale or stock performance. Priya knocked on my office door around 3 p.m., carrying the kind of manila folder that usually contained either very good news or very bad news. As our CFO, she had the poker face of someone who'd survived enough corporate restructurings to know that emotional reactions were luxury items that executives couldn't afford during crisis management scenarios. "Want to review the latest numbers over drinks?" she asked, settling into the leather chair that cost more than some people's cars. I picked up a bottle of Macallan 25 for celebrating our latest venture capital milestone. The whiskey was smooth, expensive, and exactly what I needed while reviewing spreadsheets that showed our legal tech startup was crushing every performance metric we'd promised our strategic partners. Revenue was up, client retention was solid, and our AI compliance features were getting attention from Fortune 500 companies that understood the value of regulatory risk management. Professional success felt like a life preserver when your personal life was sinking faster than a tech stock during market volatility. "How's the restructuring plan looking?" I asked, reviewing side letters from investors who wanted board representation in exchange for Series B participation. Corporate restructuring was simple compared to domestic restructuring. At least venture capitalists were honest about their motivations and put their demands in writing instead of pretending everything was fine while grinding against cowboys at suburban house parties. Priya smiled like someone who'd just closed a deal that would make shareholders very happy. Clean, efficient, profitable. The kind of reorganization that makes everyone richer except the people who weren't contributing value anyway. That evening, I canceled our anniversary party venue. A $48,000 booking at the Grand Meridian Ballroom, with crystal chandeliers and designer everything. The kind of event where Manhattan's elite would have gathered to celebrate 15 years of what they thought was a successful marriage. The caterers were understanding when I explained we were pivoting to a different type of celebration. Corporate speak for, my wife decided to celebrate someone else's anatomy instead. I rebooked the same venue for a shareholder dinner celebrating our Series B funding round, because success should be acknowledged even when personal relationships implode. The guest list would include venture capitalists, private equity partners, and tech executives who understood that business was business, regardless of domestic complications that might make the society pages. The caterer smiled when I handed over the deposit check, because money doesn't ask uncomfortable questions about why successful businessmen suddenly need to celebrate professional victories instead of personal milestones. 8 figures in annual revenue buys a lot of understanding, and tonight I needed every penny's worth. At home, the guest room felt like a luxury hotel suite where I was the only guest who mattered. The marble floors were cold but clean, the view was spectacular, and the silence was exactly what I needed to plan my next moves like a CEO preparing for a hostile takeover defense that would determine whether he kept his company or lost everything to shareholders who decided current management wasn't delivering adequate returns on their investment. I chose subtle pressure over fireworks, The kind of strategic maneuvering that venture capitalists use to edge out competitors without triggering federal investigators or unwanted attention from the U.S. Attorney's Office. When you've got enough money to influence markets and enough connections to reroute entire business ecosystems, revenge becomes an art form that doesn't require raised voices or dramatic confrontations. Just careful repositioning of assets and relationships until your target realizes they're no longer playing in the major leagues. Serena's cousin's barbecue was the perfect testing ground. One of those suburban gatherings where successful people pretend they're just regular folks who happen to drive BMWs and send their kids to prep schools that cost more than most people's annual salaries. I arrived early in my clean pickup truck, not the Tesla, because sometimes strategic messaging requires different vehicles. Wearing jeans that cost more than most people's entire wardrobes, but looked like something you'd pick up at a discount store. The smile I wore was quiet, confident, like a CEO who'd just closed a deal that would make shareholders very happy, but couldn't announce the details until after market close. I talked to Uncle Gus about acquisition strategies for his small accounting firm, explaining how consolidation in the financial services sector was creating opportunities for boutique operations with solid client lists and sustainable revenue growth. His eyes lit up when I mentioned private equity partnerships and potential word-of-mouth referrals that could triple his profitable quarters without requiring additional hires. When people asked how I was handling things, and they all asked, because suburban gossip networks are more efficient than most corporate intelligence operations, I kept my responses surgical. Better now that I know where I stand, was all I said, delivered with the kind of calm satisfaction that made people lean in for details I wasn't going to provide. The beauty of understated responses is that listeners fill in the blanks with their own assumptions, usually worse than whatever reality you're actually dealing with. Word traveled faster than insider trading information, rippling through social networks with the efficiency of a well-designed viral marketing campaign. By the time I left that barbecue, half the guests were looking at me like I'd just survived something that could have destroyed a weaker man, while the other half were probably wondering what Serena had done to earn that kind of quiet, controlled disappointment from someone who clearly wasn't the victim in whatever drama was unfolding. In parallel, I started calling in favors with the methodical precision of a compliance officer conducting an internal audit. 15 years of building relationships in Manhattan's business elite had created a network more valuable than most people's entire portfolios, and now it was time to see what kind of returns those investments would generate when properly leveraged. Our largest customer, a private equity platform that managed pension funds for half the Fortune 500, got a casual lunch invitation where I raised concerns about brand risk in their marketing partnerships. Not accusations, just thoughtful observations about how their reputation for due diligence might be impacted if they continued working with PR firms whose principals were making headlines for activities that wouldn't pass basic corporate ethics reviews. You know how it is, I told their managing partner over stakes that cost more than most people's car payments. Compliance issues at one level tend to create regulatory exposure at every level. Better to be proactive about vendor relationships than reactive after some whistleblower report makes everyone look bad. The conversation was theoretical, hypothetical, completely deniable if anyone ever asked direct questions. But 3 days later, Serena's firm got a formal notification that their PR retainer was under routine compliance review, pending resolution of potential conflicts of interest that would be resolved as soon as practical considerations allow. Corporate speak for, "You're fired, but we're going to make it sound professional." My friend at Northbridge Ventures got similar treatment during our monthly golf game at the country club, where membership costs more than most people's houses. Nothing direct, nothing that could be construed as market manipulation or conspiracy to interfere with legitimate business relationships. Just a casual conversation about how marketing budgets were being reallocated to firms with stronger reputational profiles and fewer potential liability exposures. It's all about risk management these days, I explained while lining up a putt that would have made Tiger Woods jealous. Venture capital firms can't afford to associate with service providers who might generate negative press coverage or regulatory scrutiny. Too much at stake with IPO preparations and series of funding rounds coming up. A week later, Serena's biggest client, a tech startup preparing for their public offering, quietly transferred their PR account to a competitor after their venture capital backers suggested they diversify their professional service relationships to minimize concentration risk. The decision was presented as strategic positioning rather than anything personal, because business is always business, even when it's actually about punishing someone for making choices that demonstrated poor judgment and worse character. At our next board meeting, I presented quarterly numbers that would make shareholders weep with joy. Revenue growth, client retention, market expansion, everything trending up and to the right like a perfect hockey stick graph. The chair nodded approvingly when I delivered a brief personal update with the same professional tone I'd used to discuss personnel changes or organizational restructuring. Moving forward with some domestic adjustments, I said, like I was announcing the departure of an underperforming department head. Nothing that impacts company operations or strategic planning. Leadership remains focused on delivering value for shareholders and positioning for optimal IPO timing. Stability was currency in corporate environments, and demonstrating that personal complications wouldn't affect professional performance was worth more than most people's annual salaries. Board members appreciated executives who could compartmentalize, who understood that personal drama was a luxury that publicly traded companies couldn't afford. By month's end, Serena was feeling the pressure like a startup running out of runway with no Series B funding in sight. Fewer invites to events where Manhattan's elite gathered to network and plan their next acquisitions. Cooler receptions at charity galas where social standing was measured by table proximity to the major donors. Whispers in conversations that stopped when she approached, the kind of social exile that money couldn't buy back once word got out that you'd made choices that demonstrated fundamental character defects. I never said a cruel word, never made direct accusations, never did anything that could be construed as harassment or intentional interference with legitimate business relationships. The facts handled all the messaging, spreading through social and professional networks with the efficiency of a well-designed information campaign that let people draw their own conclusions about someone whose judgment had proven unreliable in the most basic ways possible. The courthouse felt like a federal building where securities fraud cases go to die. All marble floors, and intimidating architecture designed to remind everyone that justice is expensive, time-consuming, and usually decided by whoever can afford better legal representation. I wore my Tom Ford suit like armor, the kind of tailoring that costs more than most people's cars, but signals competence to judges who understand that successful litigants don't shop at discount stores or represent themselves in matters that could determine their financial future. My attorney was worth every penny of his billionaire-tier hourly rate, the kind of divorce specialist who'd carved up more Fortune 500 marriages than a hostile takeover consultant and had the track record to prove it. He carried himself like someone who'd never met a prenuptial agreement he couldn't enforce or a community property claim he couldn't demolish with the right combination of documentation and strategic legal positioning. Case called. Vance versus Vance. The bailiff announced, voice echoing through a courtroom that had probably seen more wealth redistributed than most investment banks handle in a year. We stood like defendants at a sentencing hearing, except only one of us was about to get the kind of judgment that would make headlines in legal journals specializing in high-net-worth divorce proceedings. Serena's lawyer looked like someone who'd been hired for damage control rather than victory, the kind of attorney you get when you're trying to negotiate the best possible terms for a position everyone knows is unsustainable. He pushed for alimony with the desperation of a startup founder trying to convince venture capitalists that burning through series of funding faster than a tech company's legal compliance budget was actually a sign of aggressive growth strategy. Soft landing, he called it, like my wife was a failed company whose investors deserved compensation for their emotional investment in a business model that had proven fundamentally flawed. The phrase made me think of all those corporate restructuring meetings where executives use euphemisms to describe layoffs, acquisitions, and strategic pivots that sound better than admitting someone made catastrophically bad decisions. When it was my turn to speak, I approached the bench like I was delivering a closing argument to a jury that already knew the defendant was guilty, but needed to hear the evidence presented in logical order. My voice stayed level, professional, like I was explaining quarterly revenue projections to shareholders rather than destroying 15 years of marriage with facts that couldn't be disputed or explained away. I handed the judge a slim binder that represented months of careful documentation. Text message screenshots with timestamps that would make federal investigators proud. A chronological timeline that showed pattern and intent rather than isolated incidents. Witness statements from people whose credibility couldn't be challenged by opposing counsel. And Maya's 3-page account written with the precision of someone who understood that truth requires supporting evidence. The prenuptial agreement came out like the smoking gun in a conspiracy case, fully executed after both parties received independent counsel from law firms that specialized in high-net-worth asset protection. No coercion, no rushed signatures, no procedural irregularities that could give appeals courts grounds to overturn what we'd both agreed to when we thought love was a long-term investment rather than a temporary arrangement subject to market volatility. Separate property schedules, Your Honor, I continued, pointing to documentation that showed my assets had been carefully segregated throughout our marriage, like a compliance officer protecting company resources from potential liability exposure. The LLC title on the Tesla, the trust accounts established for Maya's education and future financial security, the brokerage equity that had been moved into structures designed to protect generational wealth from domestic litigation. I will agree to a fair settlement, I told the judge, words carrying the weight of someone who understood that fairness didn't mean equal when one party had violated the fundamental terms of their agreement. But I won't reward infidelity with financial compensation that exceeds what any reasonable person would consider appropriate for someone who breached their fiduciary duties as a spouse and partner. The phrase fiduciary duties made Serena's lawyer wince like someone who'd just realized their client's position was worse than they'd originally calculated. When you frame marriage as a contractual relationship with mutual obligations and performance standards, adultery becomes a material breach that voids most claims to sympathy or generous settlement terms. Papers rustled like stock certificates being transferred, and the judge read through documentation with the methodical attention of someone reviewing an IPO prospectus for potential red flags or regulatory compliance issues. The prenup was airtight, the evidence was overwhelming, and my legal representation was expensive enough to make federal prosecutors nervous about their conviction rates. Decree entered, the judge said, voice carrying the finality of a merger announcement that would reshape entire corporate structures. Terms as agreed, pending final asset verification and compliance with disclosure requirements. Outside, Manhattan sunshine slid down building facades like money flowing through investment portfolios during bull markets, bright and warm and promising better returns for people who'd made smart decisions about their long-term strategic positioning. I pulled out my phone and texted Maya, done. Burger night, because some celebrations require expensive restaurants while others need comfort food and family time. She responded with a heart emoji, the kind of simple communication that meant more than all the legal documents I'd been filing for months. Maya would be fine. Her trust fund was secure, her education was funded, and her relationship with both parents would survive even if one of those parents had demonstrated judgment that would make compliance officers resign rather than sign off on such catastrophically poor risk management. I headed back to the office for late board preparation, watching our machine learning dashboard tick up new client acquisitions like a stock ticker during positive earnings season. The legal tech startup we'd built was crushing every performance metric our venture capital partners had established, and our AI compliance features were getting attention from Fortune 500 companies that understood regulatory risk management was worth premium pricing. The quiet relief of a clean ledger felt better than any whiskey. Even the Macallan 25-year-old I kept in my office for celebrating major victories or surviving significant challenges. Numbers don't lie the way people do, and seeing our company's financial health trending up and to the right gave me the same satisfaction I used to get from fixing pipes or solving problems that could be resolved with the right tools and enough attention to detail. In the end, I hadn't lost a wife. I'd shed a liability that had been dragging down my personal portfolio performance for longer than I'd been willing to admit. The leak in my life was finally fixed, not with a wrench, but with boundaries, contracts, and control of my own assets in a way that protected what mattered most while eliminating exposure to people whose character couldn't pass basic due diligence review.